Today is Martin Luther King Day, and we're going to be treated or perhaps subjected to the usual over-the-top tributes to King. Now, I do admire Martin Luther King. I admire what he stood for, and I admire especially what he stood for in the critical part of his career. Early in his life, Martin Luther King was involved in some scandals. He had a plagiarism scandal, for example, and he was in many ways a flawed man. I don't really need to go into that. He also became sort of radical toward the end of his life. He wanted massive redistribution of income. He became a sort of, he became very close to a socialist, if not a socialist. But the one thing he never did was he never deviated from his central idea, which is that we as a country should be judged on our merits as individuals. In other words, in his own words, by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. This was Martin Luther King's famous dream. This is why we have Martin Luther King Day. That's what defined King. And the left now tries to imply that somehow King gave up that idea, became an advocate of affirmative action, supported race-based preferences. And none of this is true. In fact, I had a debate years ago with the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And, this was at Stanford University. And I challenged the Reverend Jackson. I said, because he was like, I knew Martin Luther King. Yes, he would have definitely been on board with affirmative action. And I said, well, quite apart from this kind of appeal to personal familiarity, can you point to a particular example where King does not support compensatory justice in a particular case, but a system-wide, nationwide system of race and ethnic preferences, let's just say in college admissions, or in job hiring, or in government contracts, absent a showing of actual discrimination? Show me where King advocated that. And of course he couldn't do it, and so he resorted to his usual deflections, iambic pentameter, this famous clearing of his throat, and so on. Now, a point I want to make about King is that, ironically, the great success of King was based upon the fact that he put himself squarely in the American and even the Christian tradition. He appealed to the Constitution and he appealed to the American founding. So far from taking the left's approach of attacking the founding, King embedded himself in the founding. When King talked about submitting a promissory note, demanding that it be cashed, he was obviously referring to the Declaration of Independence. So you have the great paradox, the great irony, that King, a black man in the 1960s, is actually appealing to a charter written by a Southern slave owner and a Southern planter. Now, the idea of colorblindness was not unique to King. Here's Frederick Douglass, as early as 1849. I'm going to quote Douglass, and you see how Douglass, in a way, was the forerunner of Martin Luther King. "It is evident that white and black must fall or flourish together," writes Douglass. "In the light of this great truth, all laws should be enacted and institutions established, all distinctions founded on complexion, and every right, privilege, and immunity now enjoyed by the white man ought to be as freely granted to the man of color." There it is. This is the Republican Frederick Douglass making the case for colorblindness in the 1840s. And so there's a tradition going on for 100 years or more of advocating for this. And so the question I want to ask is, why is it that the colorblind ideal, which was fought for so hard and so consistently, how did it prove so fragile, so evanescent, so temporary? How is it that we are now back to a race-drenched society? I think the answer is this, and that is that King focused on equality of rights, focused on the idea, let's give everybody equal rights, but he expected that once people were granted equal rights under the law, different racial groups would actually come out the same. In other words, that they would hit the finishing tape at the same time, that they would perform roughly the same in university admissions, they would prove roughly competitive in the marketplace, and this proved not to be true. It proved not to be true. Why? Well, in part because of the legacy of slavery and segregation. Basically, blacks were starting behind. And so there needed to be a project of self-improvement, yes, enabled by the government, but also pursued aggressively by the black leadership, by the civil rights leaders, and essentially within the black community. No other group can, in a sense, supervise your homework habits. No other group can dictate your savings rates. No other group can supervise the habits that enable you as a group to come up in the world. Now, this project, King was aware of it. I'm going to read a line from King. This is not very well known, but this summarizes that King was well aware of the task. Quote, "We must not let the fact that we are victims of injustice lull us into abrogating responsibility for our own lives." Think of how you're not going to hear this line quoted anywhere else today. "We must not use our oppression as an excuse for mediocrity and laziness. Our crime rate is far too high. Our level of cleanliness is frequently far too low. We are too often loud and boisterous and spend far too much on drink. By improving our standards here and now, we will go a long way toward breaking down the arguments of the segregationists, that blacks somehow are inferior, that they can't do it." And then the closing line, my favorite, this is probably my favorite line from Martin Luther King, quote, "The Negro will only be free when he reaches down into the inner depths of his own being and signs with the pen and ink of assertive manhood his own Emancipation Proclamation." So what's Martin Luther King saying here? He's saying, look, we can demand, we can agitate, we can insist upon being given equal rights under the law, and we are entitled to those rights. But we're not entitled to more than that. Once we have those rights, what we do with those rights, what we make of ourselves, the kind of American dream that we're able to chart, that ultimately is up to us.